Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Apologies for no video yesterday. If you follow me on Instagram, you might have seen there was a bit of health drama with me. Everything's fine. I'm fine. I'm good. But I had a little bit of a scare. Just had to rule out some things. All is well. I did shave, so I might look a little different than the last time you saw me. Back to the clean-shaven Christopher now, but enough about all of that. Let's dive back into some history. Today we're going to be taking a look at a video that some of you have been requesting. It's from the channel Knowledgia, which we've done videos from before. And this one is, why did the Confederates lose the war in just 2 battles? Sticking with our theme of the American Civil War from the last video we did. I would disagree with that premise, and maybe they do too. I don't know. I haven't seen the video yet. I don't think they lost the war in just 2 battles, but I think what they're talking about here is Vicksburg and Gettysburg, which is kind of the turning point that people point to in the Civil War. So we'll see what it's all about. Link is in the description if you want to check it out without my commentary, as well as all of Knowledgia's, all their other videos. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
January 1st, 1863 marks the monumental shift of meaning for the Civil War, although not in the way that many today are under the impression it did. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't actually free all slaves, and in fact was only intended to free slaves in rebel states.
Yeah, and so first of all, I should say that January 1st is the day it takes effect. It's actually issued right after the Battle of Antietam in late September of 1863. Lincoln had drafted it months earlier, but had wisely been told to wait until he could couple it with a victory, or at least something that could be sold as a victory, like Antietam, because they hadn't had many of those in the East. They'd had some in the West. So he waits. And yeah, it's just a military measure. It's meant to shift the meaning, and more importantly, it's meant to give a little bit more power to the idea of keeping Europe out of the war, because they're very unlikely to side with a South that is now fighting to defend the institution of slavery, because the North has made that a war aim.
Though not all of them. Southern secessionist states that were already occupied by the North were exempt from the proclamation.
So I should say at this point that West Virginia is becoming a state in 1863, so technically it's part of the North now, but Western Tennessee is occupied. Eastern Tennessee is still occupied by the Confederacy, but is very pro-Union in its sentiments, as are a little bit of Alabama. The thing is, I think this gets overblown a little bit. Because what happens then is, even though places like Memphis, for example, are under Union control, what you have are people who are in slavery in Confederate-held areas or in Union-held areas that are technically exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation, who flee to Memphis anyway and become what they call contraband. So there are ways that people that are technically not freed by this still get freed by it.
As were all border states. Furthermore, those states who had left the Union for the Confederacy and were not exempt weren't going to just let go of the slaves that they'd been fighting all this time to keep.
But as the Union armies march into this territory, they're able then to free those slaves in those places.
This meant that Northern military enforcement would be required for the proclamation to mean anything. Nevertheless, the act itself meant something to so many. It also officially allowed black men to join the Union Army and Navy.
And some already had been. You know, everybody talks about the 54th Massachusetts being first, but it wasn't first. It was the first kind of nationally authorized by the federal government. You have in areas where the federal army is already occupying, you have like some Kansas units that are created. You have some Louisiana units that are created down in occupied New Orleans. You've got some units created in Mississippi.
Opening the doors for hundreds of thousands of freedom-craving men to join the war effort. By the end of it all, roughly 200,000 black soldiers had risked their lives to protect their fellow countrymen.
About 10% of the army.
At the same time, the North enacted a draft for its citizens. The Confederacy had done the same a year prior, but for the Union, this was a sign of the times.
And people forget about this. We talk about, for example, Abraham Lincoln was a tyrant because he suspended habeas corpus. So did Jefferson Davis. oh, Abraham Lincoln was a tyrant because they instituted a draft. Confederates did it before that.
The war wasn't going as smoothly as President Lincoln had hoped. Thus, as conscription went into effect in the North, both sides prepared for battle once more. The Union had two goals at the moment: take down General Lee and Richmond and capture Vicksburg, thus fully controlling the Mississippi River.
So this goes all the way back to the beginning when Winfield Scott is commander-in-chief of the armed forces at the beginning of the war. He comes up with this Anaconda plan: use the Navy to squeeze from the outside, blockade Confederate ports so they can't trade, they can't import, they can't get what they need, and then squeeze them by holding things and taking Richmond in the east. It's not that far. But really, the big focus, the big movement is to be in the west, where we're going to take the Mississippi River. That's going to cut off all of this area here of the Confederacy. Because Vicksburg, for example, is a rail hub that connects to Jackson, that connects to places like Atlanta and the rest of the Southern Confederacy. So taking Vicksburg and Jackson not only help with sealing up the Mississippi, but it also helps cut things off.
The latter objective was highly concerning for the South, which had thus far been struggling to maintain their Tennessee border, as the Mississippi, Tennessee, and Cumberland rivers made it hard to keep the Northerners out. Furthermore, General Grant had already seized control of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers with the capture of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson.
These are the first victories, real victories, that the North can celebrate in February of 1862. And yeah, it basically, the moment that these forts fall, Nashville is undefendable by the Confederacy, and they know that, and they immediately start evacuating Nashville because they know they can't hold these rivers, and those rivers are now going to be occupied by the Union Navy, and that's going to mean they're going to be able to take Nashville, which they do. And that really, once Fort Henry and Donelson fall, Western Tennessee is in Union hands, or will soon be. Memphis will fall. New Orleans falls to the Navy without much of a fight. New Orleans is the largest city in the Confederacy.
Union Admiral David Farragut had also taken New Orleans, cutting the Confederates off from the Gulf of Mexico, while the capture of Memphis had nearly wrestled the Mississippi away from the South already.
And Farragut actually, they then go up the river and try to take Vicksburg with the Navy the same way they took New Orleans, and they're not able to do it.
Still, without Vicksburg, this couldn't be done. Grant was now determined to take the city and the river with it. In the summer of 1862, he had made his first attempt alongside General William T. Sherman, but the early attempt ended in a decisive defeat and withdrawal at the Battle of the Chickasaw Bayou.
Yeah, I don't know why he said in the summer, because that was at the end of December of 62. Chickasaw Bayou is such a mess of a place. If you ever go there and look at the ground there, it's brutal. And I had a couple ancestors who fought in the 22nd and 24th Kentuckys, and if you look at the battle flags from Chickasaw Bayou, they're just torn to shreds. And it was a shoeless, I whistle when I talk all the time. It was like this shoeless Confederate force that was outnumbered like 3 or 4 to 1, but they had such great ground to defend that they were able to hold. And what Sherman didn't know is that Grant, who was coming down with another force, had to stop because there was this raid that cut his supply lines, and he had to turn around and go back and couldn't get word to Sherman, so Sherman didn't have support coming from the other side.
Although the Northerners were ready to try again by the following spring. Up until this point, Grant and his men had struggled to even gain access to Vicksburg due to the surrounding swamps, bayous, and otherwise seemingly impregnable terrain.
The only way you can get at Vicksburg is from the east right here in terms of land. It's swamps to the north, it's swamps to the west on this side of the river, and so you end up having to go all the way down here to get dry land where you can cross, and that's what he ends up having to do.
Feeling innovative and quite a bit stubborn, Grant put his men to work to change this.
Yep.
For weeks, they drained bayous, built bridges, and formed roads that could actually be utilized to reach the city. Trekking along their newly constructed path through Louisiana and across the river.
So I should say that he kind of lumps all that together like it's one thing. The attempt at the canal actually ends up failing. And what they do is they try to cut a canal. You see this bend right here in the river, and it's tricky because if you look at a map of the river today, it's not where it was in 1863. It has changed. So the big bend that went real narrow and kind of was like this big loop had a little point where you could just dig across with a canal and completely cut off the loop that passed Vicksburg, and thereby bypass all the fortifications at Vicksburg that could fire on the river. So they tried to bypass that with a canal, and they weren't able to do it. So he sends out John McClernand's corps, and they build like a 40-some mile road in like a matter of days. And that allows for this entire army to move through the swamps on a road that they had just built and get down here. He runs the boats past the guns of Vicksburg. They only lose one. And then they're able to cross the army down here at Bruinsburg.
Grant and his army marched into battle. Having been called on by the general to assist, Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter led a naval force along the river to back the land troops.
And what was crazy about this is the Confederates had lined cotton up on either side of the river, and when they tried to run the batteries at night, they lit all the cotton on fire to light it up so their batteries could see. But Porter's boats were so close to the shore on the Vicksburg side that they couldn't depress the guns up on the bluffs low enough to hit the boats.
Despite being under heavy fire from Confederate defenses, Porter and his men ran the gauntlet like champs.
Yeah, they did.
Losing only a single ship in the process and providing necessary support to Grant. By April 29th, 1863, everyone was in position and ready to launch the attack.
And let me just say again that you can say what you want about guys like Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee. This is the most brilliant campaign of the American Civil War. It may be one of the most brilliant campaigns in American history. It is absolutely brilliant what Grant pulls off here.
Grant's plan was as follows. Sherman would be sent to feign an attack at Snyder's Bluff. Colonel Benjamin Garrison would lead a raid
Benjamin Grierson.
Further inland to bring Confederate forces away from Vicksburg.
You see, so here's the thing. This is the brilliance of Grant. He's a strategic guy. He's a strategic thinker, and he does this throughout the war as he gets up to command of all the armies. You see, he's always thinking about how all the pieces move in concert with each other, how they complement each other. He's great with working with the Navy. So he works with the Navy, he works with the cavalry, he works with his corps, and they all have a mission and they all have a part to play in making all of this work.
Porter would continue to provide reinforcement to the land troops, and Major General John A. McClernand and his 13th Army Corps would aim for another landing on the east bank of Grand Gulf. This bank was heavily fortified with Confederate defenders at the ready, but Grant was confident in his strategy. Starting off the foray was Porter and his gunboats, which opened fire around 8 a.m., targeting Fort Wade, followed by Fort Coben and their defenses.
Really cool place to visit. I did a video there. It was one of my very first videos I ever did on the channel. We got to tour it last year. I took a group and toured all of these sites. Really fascinating places.
The Southerners responded with their own artillery fire rather immediately, triggering a battle that would last for hours into the afternoon. The Union Navy eventually overpowered Fort Wade, but then began to struggle with the less susceptible Fort Coben.
Coben was in a more difficult spot. It's right here where I think the Big Black River empties into the Mississippi, and McClernand's corps are actually on boats waiting to land. This is like, think D-Day, think Normandy, like Omaha Beach. These guys are on boats waiting for the go-ahead to land the troops on the east side as soon as they're able to silence these forts, but they weren't able to do it.
Even with the initial success against the first fort, subsequently, Porter and Grant eventually decided to pull back as they saw the second line of defense as impenetrable.
And this is what you have to do. No plan survives contact with the enemy. Once they realize, all right, this isn't working, let's come up with a new plan. Let's improvise. Where can we go? All right, let's go down a little further. Let's land at Bruinsburg and cross there.
The Battle of the Grand Gulf had ended, and Grant had once more hit a brick wall. Vicksburg was feeling more and more untouchable, but the general refused to quit. While Grant had his sights locked on Vicksburg, Union General Joseph Hooker was tasked with something about the thorn in the north side. That thorn was General Lee. Hooker also had ambitions of seizing the Confederate capital city, but that couldn't be done without first getting the slick Virginian out of his way. Thus, Hooker and his army of 115,000 prepared for an attack on Lee's dwindled force of only 60,000. The Union commander split his troops into three, sending 2/3 over to Fredericksburg to feign an assault there,
So it was interesting. They popped up a thing about the Battle of Fredericksburg. They're not talking about the Battle of Fredericksburg here. This is, and I don't know why I think they're showing it right, but they're saying it wrong. They're showing Burnside. Burnside was in command for the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 62. Hooker takes command in January of 63 after basically what amounts to a coup. A bunch of Burnside's subordinates go up to Washington and lobby for him to be replaced. And they put Hooker in command. And so it's then under Hooker that they're going to have the Battle of Fredericksburg, which includes a feint toward, or the Battle of Chancellorsville, that includes a feint toward Fredericksburg.
Hooker took the rest of his men to the real target. Lee, knowing what was coming, decided to take a strategic gamble, considering his numerical inferiority. He first divided out 10,000 of his 60,000 men, which would be commanded by General Jubal Early. These troops would remain in Fredericksburg to defend the city. Meanwhile, Lee would take the leftover 50,000 soldiers to face off with Hooker's army of the Potomac. In a forest just west of Chancellorsville, battle erupted. For some reason, despite the clear advantage in numbers and his prior enthusiasm, Hooker suddenly ordered his men to fall back in defensive positions, giving Lee a new edge.
Hooker was always a pretty aggressive guy, but he gets timid during this battle. And at some point during the battle, he's going to get his bell rung pretty heavy by an artillery shell that's going to hit pretty close to him at his headquarters. And I think at that point, he was kind of checked out of this battle and really should have stood aside and let somebody else take command, like, Reynolds.
In yet another bold move, the Confederate general then split his troops yet again, this time sending his trusty colleague Stonewall Jackson with one portion around the Union's left flank. Stonewall marched his men straight into battle with the Union 11 Corps.
And here's the thing. 11th Corps' right flank is kind of hanging out in the air. They're not really dug in. The Union sees what's happening. You've got Dan Sickles in his 3rd Corps, and he observes the movement. And there's actually some fighting that takes place kind of in the rear guard of Stonewall Jackson's force, which is stretched out over like 10 miles. Like as the lead elements of his force are getting into position for this attack, the rear elements are just starting to march. I mean, that's how spread out they are. So it's hours of them building this force up. And the Union should have known what was coming. They should have been prepared. And even after the initial overwhelming attack happens, this was a very winnable battle for the Union.
Lee, on the other hand, would soon catch wind of an approaching Union force to the east, prompting him to again divide his men so he could face off with his attackers near Salem Church. The battle overall would result in an unexpected and rather spectacular Confederate victory. But there would be one casualty that the South would soon suffer heavily from in particular: the death of Stonewall Jackson. While returning to camp in the dark of night alongside
He was on his horse.
some of his men, the 18th North Carolina Infantry Regiment opened fire without waiting for the group to identify themselves, as they believed them to be Union soldiers. Stonewall was shot 3 times in the process, twice in the left arm and once in the right hand. Over the next few days, he would have his left arm amputated and shortly died of pneumonia complications.
So Stonewall Jackson's I was going to say a bit of a hypochondriac, but I think that would be an understatement. He's definitely a hypochondriac. He's got some weird quirks. One of them is he holds his arm up in the air when he's riding a horse. He doesn't have any chairs in his house because he thinks that sitting down makes his organs not sit right. He's always sucking on lemons. And one of the things he would do is he would lay with cold rags on his body. And this was done for him while he was recovering from his wounds. And some people think maybe that contributed. No way to know for sure. But he was recovering from the amputation. It was pneumonia that killed him.
Response from General Lee would indicate what a symbolic blow this was for the South. "I have lost my right arm. I'm bleeding at the heart."
It's the first time I've ever heard the quote that way. What I always heard the quote was Jackson's lost his left arm, but I have lost my right.
After the rebel victory, though at a steep cost, the Confederates looked for another win diplomatically. Responding to the Emancipation Proclamation, Jefferson Davis solidified his earlier statements and more through the Retaliatory Act, which went so far as enabling the execution of Northern black soldiers and their white officers.
Yep. People don't talk enough about this. You see this in the movie Glory. They announce it in the rain and tell the guys if they want to be discharged, they can. They say that any black soldiers in Union uniform will be executed on the spot, not captured. And any white officers leading black troops who are captured will be considered to be inciting servile insurrection and will be likewise put to death. And this happened a lot after battles.
This hefty political move was followed by another series of armed clashes, of course. The Battle of Raymond would see a Union triumph in Mississippi.
Battle of Raymond, baby. The frontline troops in the Battle of Raymond was the 20th Ohio. That's the unit I'm writing a book on right now. They were the very first troops to go into battle at Raymond. They were the vanguard of McPherson's Corps. So they cross at Bruinsburg. They go into battle at Port Gibson, probably the most remote, wildernessy battle ever fought in the American Civil War. Just asking the people who were on the tour with us, just driving to the Port Gibson battlefield was taking your life into your hands because the roads were so treacherous. So they fight there. They're able to take Grand Gulf then because the Confederates can't hold it at that point. They start moving forward, 3 corps all kind of moving along separate lines. They defeat the Confederates at Raymond. They take Jackson the next day. And then they burn anything of military value, and then they turn because they're not planning on holding Jackson. And out here somewhere is Joe Johnston with another army. And if you add up all the Confederate forces that Grant is facing, he's actually outnumbered. But the brilliance, one of the things that's brilliant about this campaign is that the nature of his campaign made it impossible for the Confederates to concentrate their forces because you've got Sherman feinting against Vicksburg, and so Pemberton's going to hold part of his force at Vicksburg, but send part down to fight at Grand Gulf and at Port Gibson. He's going to have part of it over at Jackson, part of it's in Raymond, and he finally decides to concentrate his forces just in time to get an order from Joe Johnston to evacuate Vicksburg and try to meet up with Johnston over here around Clinton. And so he turns his army around, and then he gets it smashed at the Battle of Champion Hill, and that really, to me, is the decisive battle of the American Civil War.
But the Battle of Jackson was a bit more indecisive. Meanwhile, Grant had been...
What was indecisive about it? Grant took Jackson in a thunderstorm, burned anything of military value, the capital of Mississippi, and then turned west and started tearing up the railroad tracks. Pretty dang decisive.
been busy finally chipping away at the path to his ultimate target. The road to Vicksburg is open, Grant told William T. Sherman in a request for reinforcements. The Confederate higher-ups were currently caught in disputes over their next move.
And this is because of Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis does not like Joe Johnston, but he loves John Pemberton, who has no business commanding the defense of Vicksburg. And so he tells Pemberton to hold Vicksburg at all costs. He tells Johnston to go and deal with Grant. Well, Johnston knows that if Pemberton gets pinned up in Vicksburg, that his army's done, that there's nothing that he can do to help him. And so you've got two guys with two competing set of priorities,
opening up the door for the Union to take full advantage. This would result in the highly significant Battle of Champion Hill.
Not just highly significant. I will die on this hill, Champion Hill, saying this is the most important battle of the Civil War.
And the Hill of Death, as deemed by Alvin P. Hovey after the fact.
One of the
The
Union
result
generals.
was a monumental Union victory and a huge step forward for Grant and his Vicksburg campaign. Another triumph for the campaign at the Battle of the Big Black River Bridge would follow, putting increasing pressure on Vicksburg as the Yankees were now set up to besiege the city.
And Grant doesn't even want to besiege the city. He wants to just take it without a siege. And so the second they're across the Big Black River, they defeat them there. Sherman's army's in the lead, or Sherman's corps is in the lead, and he's going to get there first. And he's going to move into position on the north side of Vicksburg. You're going to have McPherson's corps in the center, and then McClernand's corps on the left, on the south side. So Sherman's going to get there first, and he's going to attack on the 19th. And they're not going to be able to be successful. So then there's going to be a big wider attack on the 22nd, and that will fail as well. Then they go to siege.
15 miles of trenches were in the works as the siege of Vicksburg began. Grant was confident that this time the city would be his.
One of the most fascinating battlefields you'll ever visit is Vicksburg. It's these massive hills with deep, deep ravines. And so it's such an incredibly well-defensible city, or a highly defensible city. You can't attack it from one side because of the river. You can't attack it from the north because of the swamp. The east has these roads that go along these ridges and then these deep ravines. And so you can place these forts, these strong points on these roads to guard them. And so it makes it really, really hard to attack.
The siege began on May 18th. Trapping the 29,000-strong Confederate force under General John C. Pemberton and the civilians of Vicksburg in the city. With no supplies and under constant brain-rattling bombardment, Pemberton and all those remaining in the city after 47 days surrendered on the 4th of July, 1863. Grant's dreams had come true.
And ironically enough, Grant, who's got that nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant, does not demand an unconditional surrender at Vicksburg. Well, he tries to, but he ends up not. He ends up paroling all these guys. Like, what are they going to do with 30,000 prisoners? After Fort Donelson, they take the 20th Ohio, divide them into their companies, and send a company like these 80 guys are going to take 5,000 prisoners. These 80 guys are going to take 2,000 prisoners. They're taking them up to Massachusetts, to Fort Warren. They're taking them to St. Louis. And, he's not going to do that again with this battle. So he paroles these guys, and he does give terms.
He had taken Vicksburg, and thus the Mississippi. But a lot had happened elsewhere in his absence. The Battle of Brandy Station in Virginia played out in early June and would set the record as the largest cavalry clash in the entire war.
It was indeed.
The tussle ended with the Union troops being stymied, and another battle only days later, the Battle of Second Winchester, cleared the Yankees from the Shenandoah Valley. It seems that Grant's luck was better than his comrades, although the Union as a whole found a victory on June 20th when West Virginia officially joined it as a new state.
Incidentally, that's where Stonewall Jackson's from, is West Virginia.
This gave the Northerners something to celebrate, but just days later and hours before Grant would seize Vicksburg, one of the most tragic events of the war and America's history was to take place.
Draft riots?
The Battle of Gettysburg.
Why did we just zoom in? Oh, we're zooming in on Virginia to see the movement. Okay.
General Robert E. Lee was the man responsible. Hoping to move the conflict out of war-exhausted Virginia, Lee looked to take the fighting straight to the north, starting in Pennsylvania. With a 75,000-strong army, Lee marched into the Union state, tailed by Union General George Gordon Meade and his 95,000 men.
And while all this is happening, you have General Darius Couch is sent, I think, to Harrisburg to take control of that department. And Pennsylvania, Andrew Curtin is the governor, is issuing a call for like 90-day volunteers or like 3 months, something like that, like a short-term militia. And they're basically building an army of Pennsylvania militia, and they're sending them to places like Harrisburg and Philadelphia. So if for some reason Meade is not able to defeat this Confederate army, and they would start marching toward Harrisburg, towards Philadelphia, you're going to at least have this stopgap. You're going to have these not very well trained or equipped or led, but at least an army that can slow them down while Meade can come up from behind.
The opposing forces march on until they reach the town of Gettysburg, where Lee stops and begins preparation for the brutal attack that is to come. Meanwhile, Confederate Major General Henry Heth was on his way toward Lee.
It's pronounced Heath.
When his force stumbles upon that of Union Brigadier General John Buford. The latter fires on the former, and
the hero of the battle, by the way, John Buford.
Battle unexpectedly begins. The Confederates respond well to Union fire and start pushing the Northerners back along Chambersburg Pike.
I'm really confused by the placement of the generals in this image. So John Reynolds is technically he's the commanding general of the First Corps, but the Union Army is divided into 2 wings. And so Reynolds has command of 3 corps that are in his wing, the 1st Corps, 11th Corps, and the 3rd Corps. The other infantry corps are in Slocum's wing of the army, be the right wing. And so Reynolds, because he's commanding this whole wing, then Abner Doubleday is technically in command of the 1st Corps under him. And then when Reynolds is killed early in the battle, Doubleday is then in command of the 1st Corps for sure. Howard commands the 11th Corps. Buford commands the cavalry. So when this first happens and Heath's division marches down, it's Buford's cavalry who's right here. Oliver Howard's not even on the battlefield yet. Then Reynolds comes up with his 1st Corps, and they go into position right here. So where Doubleday is, this is all would be Reynolds' 1st Corps. And then Reynolds is killed. Doubleday is in command here. Howard's men then are over here to the right, on the right flank, facing north against Ewell's 2nd Corps as it comes down.
Though stalled, the Southerners are not being stopped. Major General John F. Reynolds' Union 1 and 11 Corps soon arrive to support Buford, but it still wouldn't be enough. Reynolds is fatally shot in the neck just as the battle is picking up, and more Confederate reinforcements are joining the fight. General Robert Rhodes and General Jubal Early clash with the Union troops nearby, and together, the rebels begin to box the Yankees in at Gettysburg.
Now, to Oliver Howard's credit, when he arrives and he starts deploying his men north of town, which is where they needed to be, because there's Confederates coming down the roads, he leaves some men to hold Cemetery Hill. He recognizes how vitally important this high ground is south of town. So Buford's decision to hold out here west of town is huge. But Howard's decision to leave some men to hold Cemetery Hill and give them a fallback point, also super important.
As the Union line collapses, many soldiers are able to flee along a nearby railroad, but others are now stuck in the town. The remaining defenders decide to regroup on Cemetery Hill to the south. Holding out in a fishhook formation, the Union men are still surrounded by Southerners, though the battle is not yet lost. Union General Dan Sickles acts next, taking his 3 corps up to Emmitsburg Road and the Peach Orchard.
Now I'm really confused why John Newton's showing up where he is. This would be where Hancock's 2nd Corps is, down. They're not as far down as the Peach Orchard. This is where the 3rd Corps would be. Hancock would be up here further. John Newton is actually a division commander in another corps that's not even showing on this map, but he's going to be given command of the 1st Corps later on over Doubleday. But the remnants of the 1st Corps are over here on Culp's Hill,
where they run into Confederate forces under the command of General James Longstreet. Sickles' plan backfires abruptly.
And Sickles actually puts his men out in like a triangle formation. So he's got half of them here, and then the other half are kind of back here. But the apex of this line is actually all the way up here at the Peach Orchard, not down there where they're showing it. So you got to shift again, everything up a little bit. The idea was that Lee was going to attack both flanks. They're going to kind of do a little bit of an attack against Culp's Hill, but the main attack's going to come here. They're expecting Sickles to be here, but he's out here,
requiring General Meads to send the entirety of his 5 Corps troops to support him.
I don't know why they're calling them 5 Corps and not 5th Corps, but the 5th Corps is actually down here. And so he sends them. Some of them go up to Little Round Top. The others are down here further south. The 5th Corps is not way up there. It's down here. I get really anal about Gettysburg.
With Longstreet
they're
now
definitely not plugged in at the Peach Orchard. They're on the other side of the 3rd Corps. It's the 2nd Corps that comes in on this side.
Focusing his attack on the Union left, General Lee sends Hill to take the center, and General Richard Ewell to go for the right. Longstreet's men hit Sickles around Devil's Den and Little Round Top, but to shockingly no avail, as the Union scrambles to bring in more reinforcements.
And again, it's the 5th Corps that's holding the area around Little Round Top.
Over at the Peach Orchard, to the contrary, Sickles' men fare quite worse. Casualties are already tallying up in unimaginable numbers as day 2 of the battle rages on.
Each day of this battle would have been in and of itself one of the bloodiest battles of the war.
The Yankees quickly fill the gap left behind by the reinforcements sent to aid Sickles and manage to knock the rebels back at the center. To the right, Generals Ewell and Early aim to rout the Northerners on and around Cemetery Hill as darkness rolls in. The Union...
Yeah, and this is some of the only night fighting you see during the Civil War, is this battle for East Cemetery Hill. It's some of the most vicious fighting of the battle. You got Union artillerymen like swinging clubs and sticks and throwing rocks and things like that.
And holds off at first, but the Confederates soon overwhelm the defenders. Northern reinforcements would shortly renew the fighting on the hill, however. But meanwhile, another Confederate, General Edward Johnson, launches an attack on the Union extreme right at Culp's Hill. With many of these troops having been sent to assist elsewhere, Union General George Greene is left with only 1,300 men to fight off the 4,500 Confederates.
George Sears Greene's the oldest general on the battlefield, and the guy was awesome. Just awesome.
Numerical superiority aids the Southerners, but Greene's men hang in there. As day 2 winds to a close, Gettysburg has already become the bloodiest battle of the Civil War.
That's true. Before they even have the third day. That's right.
Will be no better for most. As morning comes, General Lee sends reinforcements to his men at Culp's Hill, but so does General Meade. The tables have now turned, and it's the rebels who lack proper numbers.
Culp's Hill is a really underrated part of the battlefield. Not only is it a really cool site to visit on the battlefield, it's also the place that saw the most significant fighting throughout the battle. All 3 days there was significant fighting. Millions of rounds fired just in the Culp's Hill area.
Nevertheless, the Confederates engage, and a 7-hour foray commences.
Yeah, people forget that. Everybody talks about July 3rd, Pickett's charge. There were 7 hours of fighting at Culp's Hill on July 3rd.
At first, the Confederates seemed to be better off, but by noon, the tide has turned in the Union's favor. Lee, instead of calling more troops to the aid of the right, orders a full-scale attack on the Union left.
And I don't like how close they're showing this here. They should be a little wider. They should be out farther because you're going to have Pickett's charge, which is really going to be one of Longstreet's divisions, Pickett, who's the only fresh division that hasn't fought yet, and then actually 2 divisions under A.P. Hill are in this fight.
Something Meade had stunningly predicted.
Wasn't that stunning? It was Napoleonic tactics. You attacked both flanks and failed. You caused the enemy to weaken his center in order to strengthen his flanks. Now you attack the center. It was they all studied the same tactics. They all read the same books.
Making him the first to actually outsmart Robert E. Lee. The center assault would turn into the largest artillery barrage to ever occur in the Western Hemisphere. A spectacular show, but to no success for the Confederates. As the Southerners are forced to march through a mile of open, unprotected ground leading across Emmitsburg Road, the Northerners open heavy fire, ripping apart the rebel attack as Lee pushes for the assault to continue. The Confederates attempt a last-ditch effort to collapse the Union rear with an attack led by General Jeb Stuart, but this fails too.
So Stuart finally arrives on July 2nd with his cavalry. Lee sends him out and around. The Union supply line is right here on the Baltimore Pike. So this is where Union supplies are. Is Stuart trying to attack Culp's Hill? No, he's trying to get at those supply lines. He's not trying to attack from the rear and break up on the other side of Pickett's charge. He's trying to hit the supply lines. But the Union cavalry meets them in what they call the East Cavalry Field. This is where George Armstrong Custer, who's been promoted from being a captain all the way to being a brigadier general, is going to lead this really brave cavalry charge.
The entire Southern offensive is collapsing on every side. And it soon becomes clear that the Yankees have won the Battle of Gettysburg. Eventually accepting that fact, Lee withdraws toward the Potomac and back into Virginia.
It's important to note that pretty much a year before this, Meade's a brigade commander. Then he becomes a division commander. Then he becomes a corps commander. And he is one of those guys who performs well at every level. He was a good brigade commander. He was an excellent division commander. He's a great corps commander. And he's a really solid army commander. He had been in command of this army for not even 3 days when this battle takes place.
It is said that Lee told his men as early as in their retreat that the entire situation was his fault.
Yep.
And he believed this so deeply that he offered his resignation to President Jefferson Davis after the fact. And his guilt was not without reason. His attempts to take the war to the north had caused casualties so high that the wounded alone outnumbered citizens of the town 12-1.
Yep.
More than 50,000 men had been killed, wounded, or missing.
Think about that for a second. A town of 2,400 people has nearly 200,000 soldiers surrounding in the countryside fighting for 3 days, leaves behind 51,000 casualties in a town of 2,400.
The end of the 3 days. Homes and churches had to be transformed into hospitals for the wounded.
In barns.
And bullet holes riddle the town. Part of the battlefield would shortly be turned into a national cemetery for fallen Union soldiers. Slain Confederates were not so lucky. After the catastrophe that was Gettysburg, the Union victory was in many ways overshadowed by the tragedy itself and the still ongoing war. Not only that, but the excitement for many of the 54th Massachusetts Colored Infantry becoming the first African-American volunteer regiment to see combat in the war was marred by the draft riots that followed. Angry New Yorkers who felt that the conscription system favored the rich began to attack the draft office, and
it did favor the rich, but you don't solve it by attacking poor people.
Black churches, and the anger swiftly spread.
Yeah, it was ugly.
The South was faring little better, however, as the war was radically draining its economy and raising the question of how much longer they could even continue to fight. Skirmishes and small-scale clashes carried on through July. At the end of the month, President Lincoln issued General Order 252, declaring that for every black U.S. prisoner of war executed by the South, one Confederate prisoner of war would be killed in return.
He did, and that did kind of mitigate the incidents of black soldiers and white officers being killed, though it did happen. What became a bigger issue was that once Grant becomes commander-in-chief in 64 of all Union forces, the Confederates won't recognize black soldiers as equal to white soldiers in prisoner exchanges. So they're saying, listen, we're not going to give you, we're not going to consider black soldiers and white soldiers equal. You're going to have to give us more, right? And so until they're willing to do that, Grant says no more exchanges.
Tensions were on the rise, and the rebels didn't react well. Lawrence, Kansas was set to face the South's wrath. As the day began on August 21, 1863, rebel guerrillas led by William Clark Quantrill led a raid on the town that resulted...
Who I think was born in Ohio, and part of his body's buried here in northeast Ohio in Dover.
...resulted in a massacre. Much of Lawrence was burnt to the ground, and at least 160 men and boys were murdered. This wasn't even war. It was a mass-scale homicide.
Yep.
And it represented the extreme anger and desperation felt by many from the South as the war carried on and the Confederacy struggled to keep up. As such, the Union soon captured Chattanooga, Tennessee. Elsewhere at the Battle of Chickamauga, the Confederates found some hope with a victory, and General Braxton Bragg followed it up by launching a siege on Union-occupied Chattanooga.
So they hold Chattanooga, they move into northern Georgia, William Rosecrans does. Rosecrans is beat, second bloodiest battle of the war, just a couple of months after the bloodiest battle, and some of the same soldiers fought in it. Longstreet was there with some of his men. They fall back into Chattanooga. The Confederates lay siege to Chattanooga. Grant has to go west or east from operations in western Tennessee and Mississippi to take command of this. And once he relieves the siege of Chattanooga, this is kind of when everybody says, okay, Grant's definitely the guy. And this is when Lincoln makes the plans to put him in command of all Union forces.
Lee and Meade, meanwhile, clashed in Virginia at the Bristow Station campaign. Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address at the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery, and Lee was
19th.
aiming to hold out the Confederate war efforts just long enough to manipulate low Northern morale into electing a Southern sympathizer in Lincoln's upcoming re-election.
Here's what I'll say about that. I think this is one of those things maybe that gets overblown a little bit too much. The Democratic platform was to negotiate a peace with the South. But their nominee, George B. McClellan, was personally opposed to that. He wanted to win the war. Regardless, if McClellan had been elected in November, the war was already all but over at that point. Sherman had done his march to the sea. He's already going to be marching up into the Carolinas. Grant is laying siege to Petersburg. And it's only a matter of time. At this point, they're just waiting for the weather to clear in the spring so they can finish things off. So McClellan would not have taken office as president until the end of November or end of March of 1865. Just weeks before, in our real timeline, the war ended. If you're Grant and Lincoln and you know that McClellan's about to take office, you just push up your timeline a little bit and you finish the job a few weeks earlier than you otherwise did. I honestly don't think it changed the outcome.
Sadly for the rebels, however, the siege of Chattanooga eventually failed, and Bragg was forced into Georgia, while another Confederate siege on Knoxville also fell short. The South had started the war strong, but it seems that all the North's technical advantages were finally paying off.
And the North finally, at this point, has the right people in the right positions. The South did this much earlier on. The guys that are the commanding generals of armies at the beginning of the war are largely the same guys who are the commanding generals of armies at the end of the war. Joe Johnston commands an army at First Manassas, First Bull Run. He's the one in command of the army that surrenders to Sherman. Albert Sidney Johnston is killed. Robert E. Lee takes over for Joe Johnston in the East in 1862. And Beauregard, another four-star general, these are the guys that pretty much run the show for the South the whole time. It takes a couple years for the Union to start getting these right people into position. So by 1863, now you've got Grant, you've got Meade, you've got Sherman, you've got McPherson, you get George Thomas. You're getting the right people. You're going to get Sheridan in charge of the cavalry in the East. The right people are in the right positions.
Both sides wanted the war to end, but neither was ready to give in. Lee's ultimate plan could still work, but Lincoln had another offer to make any Confederate willing. Swear an oath to the United States, and your rebel acts will be forgiven.
All right, that was good. I mean, obviously some minor things we had to correct there, but obviously this is made by somebody who covers a wide variety of topics, and they're not experts on the Civil War, and that's okay. Gives us something to talk about. Hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.